Tonight on Nation and Nation, Parliament is set to resume with a broad range of issues facing Indigenous people. The seemingly never-ending housing crisis is a major one. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu promises to act on it.
There's obviously more work to be done, and my goal is to do it more quickly and more cohesively with First Nations and Indigenous communities.
That's a pledge many have heard before, says NDP Indigenous Services critic Lori Idlout. Some Nunavut residents have been on a housing wait list since Trudeau took over, and she says they need the government to deliver now.
Go beyond your promises. All the promises that you've made for the last two parliaments need to be implemented.
Welcome to Nation and Nation. I'm Brett Forster. Federal political parties are preparing for the House of Commons to resume sitting next week, and so tonight we're taking a look at what to expect from the Indigenous Services portfolio. From housing, water and infrastructure to ending discrimination in health care and child welfare, the department is facing a number of urgent issues. Patty Hajdu is the fourth minister to lead the department in just over 4 years, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay. Welcome.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Minister Hajdu, you previously served as health minister at the height of the pandemic. Are you finding your new department more or less challenging than that?
It's a great question. I think anybody who's in a leadership position, no matter what level, is challenged during the time of a pandemic like the one that we're living through. There are so many decisions, so many strains on systems, so many new ways of doing things, and so many challenges. So I'll just say it's different kinds of challenges, but of course COVID intersects with all of the kinds of things that Indigenous people are trying to achieve in their own communities.
The news of more possible burial sites at a residential school near Williams Lake First Nation broke this week. What's your department doing to prepare for more of these findings?
Well, I think from the work of Indigenous Services, the perspective is that we need to be there to support communities, especially with the trauma and the re-traumatization that discoveries like this place on families across the country. Of course, the communities that are closest to the burial are sort of first in line, if you will, because they're the members of their ancestors and their families that many times have been lost without any knowledge of what happened. Of course, it has a ripple effect across the country. Pretty much every Indigenous person in Canada has been touched by residential schools or the 60s scoop or other atrocities that have led to incredible trauma and intergenerational trauma. So my department works closely with Indigenous communities and organizations to make sure they have the supports they need to help with those mental health responses and those urgent responses as people start to reckon with just the grief and the loss this represents.
Turning to another major issue now, your government has pledged to close the infrastructure gap in Indigenous communities by 2030. Do you believe the resources are in place to do it?
Well, I think we've made a good start in terms of our commitment to closing that gap, but I do think we have a long ways to go. There are significant infrastructure gaps, whether we're talking about housing structures, community centers, running water, and all that represents, including infrastructure that gets the water from the plant to the home, roads, fire safety infrastructure. So there's a number of significant gaps under, that Indigenous people still live with. My job is to make sure we have the financial resources and smoother processes to get those gaps closed. And it's a significant piece of work for every level of government, including Indigenous leaders, because of course they're the ones planning and organizing that work in community. And it can be very challenging, especially in the context of COVID, but also for remote communities where it's difficult to get materials and equipment up, even people to stay in those communities for that length of time and to be able to host those work groups.
You mentioned housing there. Substandard housing can be just as dangerous to communities as tainted water, even potentially deadly, whether it's from fire risk or health risks. What do you say to critics who feel the Liberals have overlooked the Indigenous housing crisis?
Well, I'll say that there's obviously more work to be done, and my goal is to do it more quickly and more cohesively with First Nations and Indigenous communities, and to look for permanent solutions that are well supported so that we don't find ourselves again in 10 years talking about a lack of affordable housing. Communities are growing across this country, and we talk about a stagnating and declining population, but that's not true for Indigenous communities. In fact, Indigenous communities are seeing population growth, and so as people are having babies and families are growing, there's an increased demand for good, affordable housing across the country in Indigenous communities. And we have to work more quickly and more creatively together to make sure that we close that gap more quickly. These are actually, as you point out, this is a determinant of health. This is actually a primary determinant of health in terms of reducing spread of COVID, addressing tuberculosis, making sure people have a safe place to sleep and to study and to learn and to grow. So I consider housing actually a critical ingredient to the success of every Indigenous person in this country.
I'd like to turn to another major issue now. In your mandate letter, the Prime Minister instructed you to help First Nations transition away from the Indian Act. What do you hope to accomplish on this during your tenure as Minister?
We do have, a number of communities that have transitioned to a different model of governance with longer block funding and more autonomy from Indigenous Services Canada. And my goal is to help communities see that vision and have the tools they need in place so that more communities can adopt a method of self-governance that more aligns with their priorities and more aligns with the priorities of the people that the leaders represent in those communities. So this is a piece of work that includes financial supports, it includes governance supports, it includes self-determined legislation like the work that we've done on child welfare that is upcoming on health legislation. It includes self-determination around policing and justice systems. There's a lot of work ahead, but I know that so many people are eager to do that work, and that gives me comfort that we will get it done together.
Why doesn't the government just get rid of the Indian Act, though, and replace it with something better, something that recognizes Indigenous rights, including the right to self-govern, as you just mentioned?
Well, I think passing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was a very important step towards eliminating the Indian Act. But the Indian Act, as some Indigenous leaders will tell you, has components in it that protect rights that they have. Nothing that we do as a government should be done without consultation and the support and recognition of Indigenous people that this is the right thing for them. So as much as the Indian Act is despised, until those rights are protected in a different vehicle, then I think some leaders feel that it would be risky to actually eliminate the Indian Act without other mechanisms to protect those rights that the treaties afforded. So, for example, that's why co-developed legislation in healthcare is so important. That's why co-developed legislation in child welfare is so important, so that it commits governments at the provincial and the federal level to continue to honor those commitments in the form of legislation.
On that exact question, after the death of Joyce Echaquan, the government promised to introduce Indigenous health legislation. When is that going to happen?
Well, again, working with Indigenous partners will determine the time that's right together. There's a lot of work happening, as you know, with Indigenous communities on child welfare, on all of the infrastructure demands that you've mentioned, and of course, COVID-19 and responding to and protecting people against COVID-19, which is an enormous task for so many leaders. So we'll work with leaders to make sure that we're not in any way imposing an agenda or a timeline on leaders, but also recognizing that no government is installed forever, and that there's an urgency to doing this work because there's a willing government partner. So that is a decision that we'll take with Indigenous people.
On the question of child welfare, this also promises to remain a top agenda item while a potential class action settlement jumps through the remaining legal hoops. What happens with the other agreement on long-term program reform?
Well, that's to me a very exciting aspect of the agreement in principle that we reached with the parties over Christmas. And I'll say, to be able to move forward on long-term reform is where the true transformation begins. We've talked about the compensation, obviously recognizing that so many people were harmed through inequity and systemic discrimination, but that will not change the system. This long-term reform will, though, and it will enable communities across the country to regain control of their children and put into place measures that can protect families and support families so that the goal of keeping families intact and keeping children in community can be achieved. It's a significant commitment, about $20 billion in that bucket to do that work. And obviously C-92 strengthens that work because it provides a legislative framework for Indigenous communities to have that going forward, regardless of what happens with the federal government leadership. So this is, to me, a piece of work that all leaders can be proud of achieving the C-92 co-developed legislation. And of course, the settlement will help build on the legislation framework that's in place.
Are we going to see any of that $20 billion in this year's budget?
Well, actually, it was in the fall economic statement and accounted for, the $40 billion, actually, $20 billion for compensation, $20 billion for the long-term reform. So that money is committed, and it will be dispersed as communities are ready to receive it.
And finally, it seems likely that the pandemic will dominate discussion when the House resumes once again. Has the Omicron wave started to subside in Indigenous communities?
We're starting to see some positive trends in some communities, but in other parts of the country, cases are still climbing. I will just say this is a very, very risky time for everyone as we are all exhausted. This is not an easy time for anyone, no matter what your age, no matter what your circumstance. And so we work very closely, as you know, across the country with First Nations and Indigenous partners to give support to the work they're doing to protect their residents and their citizens. It's very, very exhausting, though, for even individuals, who have been asked to stay apart, who have been in isolation. And of course, as cases climb, it can be even more challenging. I actually have members of my family that have contracted COVID-19, and although physically they're okay, that isolation that people go through when they're sick is very lonely. So there's a mental health aspect to this that obviously we're supporting a response to as well. So this is something that we'll continue to work on to continue to be there for First Nations and Indigenous people so that they have the supports they need to help people through this really challenging time in our history.
All right, Minister, we have to leave it there, but I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Take care of yourself.
Coming up in just a few minutes, NDP Indigenous Services critic Lori Idlout will join me to respond. Stick around for that. Welcome back. Lori Idlout is the NDP Member of Parliament for Nunavut. She's already known for asking her first question in the House of Commons in Inuktitut. Idlout has also been pressing the Infrastructure Minister Dominic LeBlanc to do something immediately about the water crisis in Iqaluit. But Idlout is also the NDP's critic of Indigenous Services, and as such, she joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Miss Idlout.
Brent, it's good to see you again.
So it's still fairly early, but how would you rate Patty Hajdu's job as Indigenous Services Minister?
Minister Hajdu has a lot of responsibilities. I understand that, and she has such a broad mandate. I would say that it's still very early on, and she still has a lot of work to do. I've had a good first meeting with her. I feel like we'll have a good working relationship, and we know that she understands that if I need to apply pressure, that's what I'll be doing.
Even before Minister Hajdu took the reins, the Liberals have committed a lot of money to Indigenous concerns since first forming government. Has this not been enough?
I think when it comes to resources for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, most times it's never enough. The commitments for housing, the commitments for addressing boil water advisories, they've always been so low that when it seems like larger amounts are committed, there's a lot of praise, but even those large amounts aren't sufficient to meet even the basic needs and demands of ensuring that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit can be on par with the rest of Canada.
What then is the main issue the Liberals have missed that should be at the top of Minister Hajdu's list to get resolved quickly?
They've said the right words about knowing that there's a lot of work to do, but their commitments to resource First Nations, Métis, and Inuit specific issues need to be a lot more. For example, the funding that was announced for counseling for the MMIWG, 300,000 over 3 years, just was not sufficient. It isn't nearly enough. So there needs to be a lot more resources, and to also make sure that when they work to address the boil advisories, it's great to see that they're willing to put the funds in for increasing and improving the infrastructure, but they also need to make sure that to have the infrastructure working, that resources are also put in to ensure that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are equipped to maintain the infrastructure as well. And thirdly, there needs to be a better recognition of the skills and expertise that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit do have. Rather than focusing on our deficits, they need to realize that by using the expertise and skills that we have, that there could be a better relationship to make sure that we're working together for the betterment of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit.
Now, it's been many months since the Indigenous Affairs Committee has studied anything. What's one issue you'd like to see the committee tackle once the new session gets underway?
So I'm a part of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee. We did have our first meeting in December, shortly after the membership was announced. We have decided that we'll be discussing 4 different study areas up to June 19th. The proposal that I made to study is on the non-insured health benefits program. We need to make sure that its administration is functioning properly, but I've also proposed that as a way to start recognizing the skills that do exist in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, that we find ways to hire and incorporate existing volunteers so that they can be paid through the non-insured health benefits.
Yes, on that note, there is talk of an Indigenous Health Act being tabled. The minister won't give a timeline on when it might be put forward. What do you think should be in that act?
I think what needs to be, first of all, it's great to hear that an idea like that has been put on the table. I have not heard of it. I'll definitely keep my ears open for that. It definitely needs to make sure that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are the governance structure, and that they are the ones who decide what health means for each First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and that they are resourced to make sure that they can deliver on the health system that works for each First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities.
Now, the Liberals have occasionally come under criticism for failing to deliver on some of their promises regarding reconciliation. How would the approach of an NDP government be different if it was in charge of Indigenous services?
The NDP, we are very much always about making sure that we are there for those people that are that are Canadians, that are everyday Canadians, and I consider First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to be everyday Canadians, that we should be part of the decision making. I think the work that we would do is very much focused on ensuring that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are part of the decision making, whose governance structures have existed for thousands of years, are able to be used, that we're able to respect them, and that we're finding ways to make sure that our worldviews are allowed to be used within this system. I know that we talk a lot in politics or in Canada about how there's the executive branch and the legislative branch, and there's still void with the decision making. The Indigenous legal traditions, I think, would be a huge study area that I would accelerate.
This is ultimately a minority government, and Trudeau is going to be relying on the NDP to pass legislation. So what would it take for him to lose the NDP's support?
That's very much an area that I haven't really focused on. I don't think I can answer that specifically, but what they do need to keep doing is go beyond your promises. All the promises that you've made for the last two parliaments need to be implemented. You've made promises in housing, for example, that we're still waiting for. There are too many people, there were too many constituents of mine that told me that when they first voted for the Liberal government, that they were on the waiting list for a house. And all these years later, they're still on a waiting list. They're still waiting to have a home. And there just needs to be a lot more resources to make sure that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit don't continue to suffer third world conditions because of promises that are not being implemented. So we just need to really see that all the promises that were made, and to make sure that they're actually being implemented, not just individually as the Liberal government, but in true partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governance.
All right, Ms. Idlout, I want to thank you for your time. We have to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Brent.
We'll have much more on Nation and Nation in just a few minutes. Stick around. Welcome back. We are just about out of time. As we just heard, there will be no shortage of issues on the docket when the House of Commons returns. MPs will be back on the Hill. Committees will be up and running again right into June. Meanwhile, the search for unmarked graves at residential schools continues across Canada, and the grassroots push for Indigenous rights shows no signs of subsiding. We'll have plenty of political coverage for you along the way on Nation to Nation. Remember, if you missed any part of tonight's show or want to listen to past episodes, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forster. Thanks for watching, and have a great evening.